Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Trident's Marketing Communication Manager, Daniel Sloan, and we're excited to be bringing you today's Culture of Research and Education webinar called Qualitative Data Analysis for Applied Research. The core webinar series is designed to provide faculty, students, and alumni an opportunity to share their research and scholarship with the Trident community. By fostering a culture of professional development and idea exchange, participants will have access to a valuable forum for lifelong learning. This university-wide effort is coordinated by Trident's doctoral studies directors. A few notes before we begin things today. You're welcome to ask questions at any time, and actually we encourage you to ask questions and share your experiences with today's subject matter. You can do that by finding the question box on the control panel, right-hand side of your screen, about halfway down. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of today's presentations. Don't raise your hand, just submit your question through that box, or you can email me. My email is on the screen right now. We'll record this webinar and it will be available to all attendees later this week or early next week, as well as the slide deck. And now let's introduce our presenters. First up is Dr. Indira Guzman, who is the Doctoral Studies Director in the Glenn R. Jones College of Business at Trident and a Professor of IT Management. She's been a faculty member and dissertation mentor at Trident since 2006. Her research has been published in over 50 academic outlets. Next up, we have Dr. Christopher Linski. He completed his doctorate in business management and postdoctoral studies in higher education leadership from Colorado Technical University. He is a retired member of the U.S. Armed Forces, and he has owned a management consultant business and a nonprofit organization. In addition to his role at Trident as Professor of Doctoral Studies for the DBA program, he is also the State Student Veterans Chairman, District Commander nominee, and current Post Commander of the Veterans of Foreign Wars of the United States. Welcome to our two presenters, and welcome, Dr. Guzman. The floor is yours.
Okay, and thank you very much, Danny, for the introduction, and thank you all of you who are attending this webinar today. Well, this is a very important topic, and I am very happy that we are organizing these core webinars. As Danny mentioned, these webinars are organized to provide doctoral students with an opportunity to discuss all kinds of different topics, and specifically today we're going to discuss characteristics of qualitative data analysis, some types of qualitative data analysis, an examination of the different analysis procedures that are provided in the literature, and also an introduction to the process of writing the analysis chapter for doctoral studies. In addition, we will hear from two of our own graduates, Dr. Vernell Hall, who recently graduated from our DBA program, and Dr. Robert Rossi, who is a recent graduate from our Ph.D. program. So I want to thank especially both of them, Dr. Hall and Dr. Rossi, for joining Dr. Linski and me in this webinar today, and for sharing their experience conducting qualitative data analysis in their own doctoral study project and dissertation, respectively. So why is this topic important? Well, this topic is important because all of our doctoral studies, either in the dissertation or in the DBA program, are empirical studies. They use empirical data, either primary data that was collected by them personally for the purpose of their dissertation or doctoral study, or secondary data that was previously collected by a third party and then it's used by the doctoral study in their projects. So in both situations, students will analyze the data to answer the research questions and use scientific methods to do that. In this webinar, we will again talk about these data analysis techniques, but we will focus on qualitative data. Now, it's important to mention that this is specifically especially useful for DBA students, because in the DBA program we use qualitative methods. But it's also it can also be useful for PhD students, even because, as demonstrated by the participation of our own graduate from the PhD BA program, some PhD students use both quantitative and qualitative methods, what we call a mixed method approach. And then the discussion of the qualitative data analysis today can also be useful. The core webinars are especially a good way to have this kind of discussion, because they serve especially all doctoral students. But I want to emphasize that we organize these core webinars. We take turns by program, and now is the turn of the College of Business, but we always appreciate and welcome ideas for core webinars. So you're welcome to send your suggestions as well. So again, these are important topics for doctoral students. Let's talk about the applied research methods and how we focus on why this, how is this topic relevant, especially for applied research? Well, as you know, the DBA program, in the DBA program, students are expected to make intellectual contributions based on knowledge of theory and the application of scientific methods of inquiry. So we focus on applied research, meaning that they are expected to apply knowledge directly to important problems in business and management. These intellectual contributions are based on knowledge of theory, but they use different approaches of inquiry and use these scientific methods. Now, when we talk about the different prominent designs of methods of inquiry, we can mention things like case study, action research, process improvement, phenomenology, and ethnography, and other methods, but we emphasize specifically in the DBA program on case study. That is the most appropriate, especially because it focuses on a single event, organization, process, program. And in this case, in most of our DBA doctoral studies, is a focus on a single organization, which is going to be in a specific, unique, bounded system, right? The entire organization. And we expect different, the use of different data collection techniques. For example, our students use things like interviews, focus group, questionnaire, participant observations, and so on. So those are going to be the different techniques to collect data. Now, the appropriate selection of the methods of inquiry is contextual, because it will depend to a large extent on the learning standards of a doctoral program, but more importantly, the ones that are more appropriate for the context and that will help answer the research question. And as I said, those are the ones that we use in the DBA program. So what is data analysis? Data analysis is, well, here you have a definition as the process of reducing raw data, displaying the reduced data, and determining what they meant. So it's really use of systematic use of data analysis techniques that will help us describe, condense, find themes, evaluate, and basically go from mass of data to meaningful insights. And that is how we're going to answer our research questions. So this means to generate usable results from the collected data, and that those are going to be reflected in Chapter 4, and also determine how data collected answers, how exactly this data is going to answer those research questions. And that's where we use the different methods which we are going to discuss today. In terms of the different data analysis, just to clarify, there's the qualitative analysis and the quantitative analysis. The qualitative analysis will focus on different approaches to interpret prose-based data. Remember, we're using words, right? In qualitative data, it's all words. and we are going to determine how these results will answer the research question, and the results could be, I mean, the process is more subjective, and there are some ambiguous rules which we have to accept as part of the research, but still we follow some systematic approach. The quantitative analysis, on the other hand, is the one that uses numbers, statistics, the one that is more appropriate for the PhD program, because we're looking for some generalizability. And this quantitative analysis refers to the analytical approaches of interpreting all those numbers. And again, this data is going to be used to answer the research question, but mainly in quantitative approach is to prove or disprove hypotheses. And then that kind of quantitative analysis is more objective in nature. So in this particular webinar, we are focusing on the qualitative data analysis, and Dr. Linski will continue with the different techniques.
Thank you, Dr. Guzman. So one of the important things to understand when beginning the qualitative data analysis process, and that's determining which type of analysis you need to do for this data that you're collecting. And so these are just 4 of the most prominent types of qualitative data analysis, but these are definitely not the only 4 that are available to you. And so looking at thematic analysis, it really is an examination of a set of texts, and you're trying to identify common topics, ideas, or patterns from the text that you've received in order to make meaning out of it. And really that is what we call themes. That meaning or that overall concept that comes from the data creates a list of themes that answer your research questions. In descriptive analysis, we're really looking at the aim of summarizing sensory characteristics. This is using technical language. It's very descriptive. Ultimately, it details the attributes of what has been discovered simply based on the terms and concepts explained by participants or data that's been gathered. Content analysis really focuses on interpreting data and describing the meaningful relationship based on contents. And the content is the framed research objective, or the framework that's used, usually both conceptual framework and theoretical frameworks that allow you to understand both how it relates to concepts in the literature, and for especially the applied research, how that concept directly relates to the organization that's being evaluated. The last that I've provided here is the narrative analysis. This really gets into things like phenomenology, where you are using an analytical framework regarding the interpretation of stories. And so this really has to do with how the story is actually structured from the participants, the substance, the actual content of that story, and the performance of the story. So the actual storytelling itself, how the story is told, can be part of the analysis when you're utilizing narrative analysis. Now, looking forward to the actual processes for data analysis, we really want to make sure that we're using the literature. So there are numerous authors that have provided literature that say this is a great process to do this. Now, the 3 that are listed here can be utilized in multiple types of data analysis. Now, Yen is very, his expertise is based on the case study design. And so if you are looking to do case study, especially in the DBA program, I highly recommend looking at Yen. Yen's process really understands how the 3 sources of data utilized in structuring case studies need to be utilized and triangulated in order to make sense of the data. Braun and Clark uses a thematic analysis process But Braun and Clark provides a very simplistic 6-step approach, but it really allows for the student, especially a novice research student, to understand just the basic concepts of analysis. And then after you understand the basics, then you'll get more in depth for each step. And I'll get into that in just a moment. The last literature that I provided here is Saldania. Saldania really focuses on coding, which is a part of the analysis process where you have to generate the main terms, the main concepts, before you get into theming, or before you make the final conclusions. The coding process simply understands, here's what I'm seeing, here's the list of traits and attributes that I have found from the data that I've collected. And Saldania does a great job of explaining that process. Regardless of the author that you use, you have to use their steps, right? It is a scientific approach, which means you have to replicate what is out there regarding the process. After that, you want to explain the detailed completion of your steps. And I'll give a quick example. Braun and Clark's first step is to familiarize yourself with the data. Well, there's many ways that you as a researcher can familiarize yourself. And so if you have, let's say, questionnaires or interview transcripts, your familiarization may be, I'm going to read these twice. Every document that I have, I'm just going to read it twice so that I can understand what it is that's being said. I'm not trying to interpret it yet. I just want to understand the words that are on the paper. And then you move forward to the next step. Same thing in this process, as we're looking at there we are, analysis software. We have to understand that sometimes the best way to utilize these processes is to use other resources to help us. During the collection and analysis process, for many of you in the DBA program, you're going to be doing interviews and you need to transcribe that data before you can utilize it. The transcripts are the physical data record that you need in order to move it into a software that allows you to analyze what you have found. And there are many softwares available that provide assistance in both storing and processing the raw data. The one thing we want all students to understand is when you use data analysis software, it's not doing the analysis for you. Instead, most of them are going to provide you some general analytics, right? It's going to tell you the number of times a word may be shown or is populated within your text. But ultimately, it's simply an electronic way for you to process the data yourself, for you to highlight, make marks, comment on it, and really do that instead of doing it on paper, as we, of course, used to do. 3 of the available softwares for qualitative data analysis: Deduce, that is one that we specifically use in the DBA program. MaxQDA is very specific to qualitative research, and NVivo is broadening out. I believe they now have analysis software for both qualitative and quantitative data analysis. However, the software never determines your results. The software cannot answer your research question for you. It doesn't know what your research question is. All it is going to do is take the text that you have and assist you in sorting it so that you can create the findings yourself. And then lastly, we want to talk about, for my portion, structuring the results of the analysis. So what do you do once you have this list of themes or codes, or you've done the Braun and Clark 6-step method? What do you do with it? Of course, for those in the DBA program, you're going to be writing Chapter 4 of the DSP. In the Ph.D. program, you're going to be writing Chapter 4 of the dissertation, and that is, of course, your data analysis section. but it's the findings of that data analysis that you're reporting. This really becomes one of the most important concepts of any doctoral research. If your findings don't make sense, if the findings don't relate back to your conceptual framework, your theoretical foundation, or your research questions, then you haven't completed a quality research study. So we have to be able to report the results to where the reader, and for DBA students, the executive of the organization, can understand what your findings mean to that organization. There are multiple techniques for structuring these results. One of the easiest ways, of course, is by contribution to the research question. So if you have two different research questions, for example, you're examining both attitudes and behaviors of a specific cultural issue. The attitudes could be one specific way that you separate your contribution, and then behaviors, the data relating to behaviors, would be separated as your second contribution. This can be difficult if you only have one research question, or you have two research questions, but the second doesn't provide a second variable or a second concept that can be divided based on results, especially if you have overlapping results. Now, if you are separating by theoretical constructs, then you're taking that similar to the content analysis, where you're really dividing it based on the actual terms and themes within the data, within the literature that you have provided. So if you have a theoretical framework and that framework has 6 major concepts, you would then divide your chapter 4 into those 6 different concepts to explain how your results relate back to your theory. And then, of course, you would do that for multiple theories or multiple models if you're using, for the DBA program, at least 2 theories or models that relate back to your problem statement. You can also order results by significance, meaning that you believe that number 1 is the most important finding. This really comes down to researcher discretion, or it could be relevant to the significance that you provided in the beginning chapters of your research study. Ordering results by dominance of terms simply means that if deduce says that you have these 7 terms and the top one got 100 results that it was provided throughout your data, and the second term had 70 results, the third term had 50 results, you would order it by the dominance of those terms, as long as those terms become the actual impact on your research study. One of the confusing things that happen, an example is if you're doing a study on recycling and you have the word recycling come up 150 times in a single interview, simply because you and the participant are both saying the word recycling. Recycling doesn't give you anything. There's no new data there that helps solve a problem or helps answer your research question. So the dominance of terms must be created based on its dominance of terms that relate to the research question. And then the schema used must be clear and logical to the reader. One of the important things is you may have to do this in different ways. You may have your interview data divided and analyzed in a different manner than you do your survey data, especially if you're doing something like a mixed method study where you have qualitative and quantitative data. That really requires you to understand multiple forms of data analysis processes and then how to combine them, often using triangulation or the combination of 3 or more sources of data to understand how they impact each other. And hopefully that provided a good overview of really how to structure the results. But with that, what we'd like to do is introduce our next 2 panelists. And so, first of all, my privilege to introduce two doctoral alumni from Trident. The first, Dr. Vernell Hall. Dr. Hall completed the Doctor of Business Administration program here at Trident at AIU here in 2020, so recent graduate. Congratulations, Dr. Hall. Our next presenter will be Dr. Robert Rossi. Dr. Robert Rossi is a part-time faculty member in the Glenn R. Jones College of Business here at Trident. Graduated from Trident in 2019 with the Ph.D. in Business Administration. He joined Trident as a faculty member in 2020. And Robert has over 30 years of IT experience and is currently the Director of IT Product Management. So welcome, Dr. Rossi. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Hall to provide some experiences that he had relating to the analysis process during his DBA program. Thank you, Dr. Hall.
Thank you, Dr. Linski. Good evening, everyone. And as Dr. Linski stated, I'm Dr. Hall. Tonight, what I would like to just do is share some of my experiences while conducting my doctoral study project with utilizing the qualitative analysis process. So for my doctoral study project, I conducted my study on examining an information system used to process an employee's award. And basically this right here was, and like I stated, I utilized the qualitative analysis process for this. So I would first start saying, as was alluded to earlier, there's different types of methods or tools to use to collect the data. And what I utilized for my study was interviews, questionnaires, and archival data. I would say that for the interview recordings, as Dr. Linski stated, you have to transcribe them, and I utilize online software to transcribe the interview recordings. Now, the software that I utilize afforded me the ability to carefully listen to the audio files and proofread the written transcript simultaneously for accuracy. I corrected some of the wordings when I was conducting the actual transcript and phrases that were inadvertently typed during the actual transcribing of the data. Now, subsequently, all transcripts were uploaded into Deduce, which we talked about was a programming you can utilize for programming and coding, following a thematic content analysis approach, which is what I utilize. And I utilize the actual thematic approach of Braun and Clark, which was a 6-phase process. The first phase was I basically immersed myself into reading and rereading the actual data to ensure that I was familiar with it. And then second, I conducted codes and created codes and labels in Deduce. The third phase consisted of reviewing and organizing any similar or pertinent coded data excerpts into themes. Next was the actual codes and themes were reviewed and refined. In that particular phase right there, that fourth phase, I spoke a lot with my committee chair, Dr. Cox, because at that point I was trying to really look at how do I take these themes that I'm seeing and give the best actual wording that will cover all of the codes. And then after that right there, once again, I finalized the actual themes and things of such. And then in the sixth phase, I was basically generating the final analysis. And to further ensure that I created some validity for this, I utilized what was also known as the methodical triangulation. And this is no more than utilizing different data collection methods in order to check for consistency of the findings. And as I stated, I kind of utilized Deduce as my program, which you'll kind of see in the next slide. And in this particular, while utilizing Deduce, I was able to actually highlight some of the excerpts and actually code them utilizing concepts, experiences, and themes associated with the research study question. And I had 2 research study questions that I was trying to answer. The code labeling allowed me to actually help later on when I was actually conducting my themes. And comparing the similarities helped in the attempt to identify some of the actual themes that were actually emerged from my actual study. And some of the themes, there were 5 themes that actually emerged from my study. Here you can kind of see the 5 themes, which help kind of answer the research question. One of the things I was stating, and we kind of talked about the dominance of terms. As you can kind of see on here, you can see some of the numbers. What deduce also does is that it'll allow you to, like I said, look at some of the frequency of how many times these words are coming up, but not just the word itself, but how do these words apply to your particular study. And with this right here, one example was a perceived ease of use and usefulness. In there, you could kind of see there was like 31 different times that those particular terms came up as I was conducting my analysis. And what I'll now be followed by is Dr. Rossi.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Hall. So I started out on my journey with my dissertation, and it started out with focusing on quantitative data. I was going to do a survey, and after meeting with my committee, Dr. Guzman was on my committee, I had Dr. Luffman on my committee, Dr. Lind. It was thought that adding in qualitative data into the dissertation would flesh it out a little bit more. My dissertation centered around IT project success, and I was coming at that on a quantitative point of view, doing a survey of project management professionals, basically project managers. It was thought that by doing interviews of senior business people, CEOs, CIOs, that I could bring a little bit more of a cohesive look, an end-to-end look, so to speak, of IT project success. So that's what I did. Focusing on the qualitative data analysis, I used the Cresswell methodology, which I looked at several different types of authors who looked at this kind of the methodology, and Cresswell spoke to me. I thought that was really, using the phenomenology approach, it was really something that I thought would work well for what I wanted to do. And again, but it follows a similar process as was spoke about earlier, where you're developing your codes and your themes. So with the face-to-face interviews, they used audio recordings in order to do the interviews. There was, I did close to 20 interviews. There was one interview where the person declined to have an audio recording produced, and that was suboptimum. I would not recommend it. The data that I was able to get out of that, the notes that I was able to take, didn't quite measure up and wasn't really robust enough compared to all of the recordings I had that I was able to record. I used a tool called Sonics, which was able to translate those audio recordings into text. Averaged about 90 or 95% success. I had to go back through those files, verify them against the recording, and do some corrections. Next step was an extensive review and re-review of all the interviews. I had to go over each interview several times, and each time I did it, I found something different. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times per interview is not uncommon. Use the deduce tool. I don't know that I use it to the extent that Dr. Hall did it, props to him, but I was able to use it to help identify codes and then subsequently identify the themes, roll those up into the final results. As was stated earlier, the final results and how you put together the tool itself will not compute those for you. So I ended up with three major themes and several codes. And again, this project revolved around IT project success. It involved use of the Agile methodology, technological turbulence, which I ended up falling out because it just wasn't that major of an indicator in business IT alignment maturity. So here's an example of one of the codes that was developed. What it turned into was a new definition of IT project success. And that was developed, again, by the richness and the depth of all of the interviews and some of the particular quotes and passion that came out of a lot of those interviews. These interviews were with senior people. These were with CEOs. These were with leaders of technology, and getting their insight was really key. And like I said, I was able to come up with a new and upgraded version of IT Project Success. Thank you.
Oh, great. Guess that wraps your presentation, Dr. Rossi. And I believe Dr. Guzman has a few closing thoughts before we get to Q&A, correct?
Yes, I just want to thank again Drs. Hall and Dr. Rossi and Dr. Linski for their presentation. I think this was a good discussion to go over the purpose, the vision, and why we need to look at this topic. Then some great definitions, some literature. We always need literature in the doctoral programs, and then these great examples. It makes me really proud to see our own graduates talk about their robust research and the interesting findings, and particularly the application of scientific techniques and even the software that they used and how they came up with their findings and how they conducted the data analysis. So thank you, everyone. I think we are ready for your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Guzman. And thank you to everyone who's sending questions already. We have quite a few of them already. And one thing I want to address up front is, because we've had about 10 people ask this, is that yes, we will be sending out the slides probably Monday or Tuesday at the latest. We'll get those out to you, so you don't have to worry about that. And the first question we have, this is going to Dr. Rossi. And the question is, did you measure the quality of the product?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The quality, did I measure the quality of, I was measuring IT Project Success. So yes, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay. Yeah, and to the person who asked that, if you could clarify, that would be appreciated. And next question, this one is for Dr. Linski. And question is, I'm in the midst of a focus group, and I'm worried about my own biases to the subject matter. Are there surefire ways to avoid my own biases when asking questions and going through the data?
Absolutely. So first of all, especially in qualitative research, bias is always going to be a concern for every researcher. You have to know what your researcher bias is, and especially for our students, where many of them are working on research studies either in a very passionate field that they're very well knowledgeable about, or an organization that they work in or have worked in the past. And so when you get into the understanding that, yes, I'm going to be biased, that's the #1 requirement, is you have to evaluate yourself and figure out what is the bias that's there. When you determine what that bias is, then you figure out ways to get around that bias, acknowledging it and actually writing it into your limitations in your research study. We have learned that the psychology of identifying our self-biases helps us move around those. In a focus group, if you're looking at the questions, what we recommend, and in the DBA program you're going to do, and I'm sure in the PhDBA as well, is you have to find a way to validate or review your instruments for reliability. And what that means is either you're going out and doing a pilot study to where individuals take your instruments, complete the data collection, and you determine if there are changes necessary. That is a pilot study that doesn't get included into your overall results. It's just a preparatory action for understanding, okay, it sounds like I'm kind of leading the witness, as they say. The other is to do an expert panel review where you have field experts provide information that says this doesn't make sense to a layperson, or it doesn't make sense to someone who's not familiar with your topic. And so you need to remove yourself, remove the information about your experiences so that the individual really providing that data is providing data that is clearly their own perspective on the questions.
Great, thank you. And next question, I'm going to stick with focus groups, and I'm going to start this with Dr. Linski, but I also would like to hear from Dr. Guzman and our alumni if there's anything to add. But are focus groups responses normally recorded, or would one use a scribe, and which one would you recommend?
So anytime you're collecting audio, you really want to have that recorded. So interviews, focus groups, even if you're doing observation, if it's going to be an observation that involves some discussion among participants, you want to be able to recall that information weeks later. You may start data collection and then something happens and it may be 2 weeks later before you get to the next one. Those interviews, you may forget who said what. So that recording allows you to look back weeks, months, years later and still have the same ability to code that data. Without the audio, you can't do transcripts. You can do notes, as Dr. Rossi said. Sometimes you have to simply use notes. It doesn't provide as much robust information because it's only what you as the researcher write down. You may not remember what the actual participant said in the coming weeks.
And any further input on that? I know, Dr. Rossi, you mentioned a bit about focus group interviews, and Dr. Guzman. Let's start with Dr. Guzman. Do you have anything to add, and then go to Dr. Rossi?
Sure. So when you do focus group, definitely recording is important. I mean, in my experience, when I had focus groups, I actually had multiple ways to record the words that participants were saying. So that means do the audio recording, the video recording, and as well as taking notes. So, so that's, again, the way to make sure that you are capturing as much as possible from the participants to allow you, conduct your data analysis. So that I would recommend multiple recordings. And just going back to the bias question, I would also say that practice is very important. So if you practice yourself asking the questions and you record yourself asking your questions and conducting your interview, when you observe yourself doing that, then you identify what kind of behaviors you do that could be biased. Even some movements when your head is like, you are showing your agreement or disagreement with certain statement, even visually. That's something that you can control if you are aware about it in advance. And that's why practicing, conducting your interviews before you conduct them is useful.
And Dr. Ross, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say on the subject of bias, I mean, I was very familiar with my material when I was doing these interviews, and there were times when I caught myself leading the witness, so to speak, or again with either verbal or just facial expressions, and you really have to step back. You really have to take yourself and to be very, 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 very neutral and try and phrase the questions the same, try and lead the conversation the same way, or you can get into that trap of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can end up leading somebody down the path that you ultimately want them to do. So again, the bias is very, very critical. You have to be very self-critical and really really bring yourself to a point where you have a real poker face, especially in these interviews, especially if you hear something you totally disagree with, right? So. It's important.
Great advice. Let's go to Dr. Hall. You spoke about codes, and we have someone who would like to know a bit more about codes. They're not sure what they are, and is that term specific to the software Deduce or to the dissertation or DSP?
So for the codes, so the codes were generated. You'll create your own codes based off of the data that you're actually seeing. And what I did for mine was, once I began to look at the transcripts, like I said, become familiar with what the information is on the actual different type of methods or instruments. When I began to look at all the different instruments, I began to see certain things. I began to see certain words. I began to see certain words that align with the actual questions that I was asking. And from that, I began to create those codes.
Great, thank you. And next question, I'm going to start, actually, this one was directed to Dr. Hall. I'm going to start with you, but this will be good to hear from Dr. Linski and Dr. Guzman on this one as well. But Dr. Hall, how did you handle the issue of written consent for participants?
Could you state that again?
Yeah, how did you handle the issue of written consent for participants?
So for the written consent, what I did was, before I would even actually send out the actual, because I utilized interviews and questionnaires and interviews. So what I did was I sent a consent form out to those individuals. I emailed it to them first, and then tried to get their consent prior to even sending out the surveys. Because what I found was, I originally was soliciting, I needed at least 15 different individuals to be a part of it. So what I initially found was that I had about 30 that said that they wanted to take part in it, but yet I didn't get all 30 of those individuals to take part in it. So, but anyway, what I did was, like I said, I sent the consent form out to those individuals prior to actually sending them the survey to try to get their consent. And then when I actually conducted my interviews, I would also try to make sure I got their consent prior to even beginning the interviews.
Thanks. And Dr. Guzman, do you have anything to add about written consent in these situations?
No, I think that Dr. Hall addressed that correctly. I mean, this is something that I would like to emphasize, that we all need to follow IRB requirements and just document the entire process, how the data collection is gonna happen, and that should be part of the consent form, where you specifically let the participants know what's going to happen with the research and what kind of data you're collecting and the rights. So that has to do with the IRB, and just to remind everyone, no data can be collected without IRB approval.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go back to Dr. Linski, and question is, and excuse me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, would in vivo software provide equally good data analysis under qualitative, just as Deduce does?
Yeah, so anytime you're evaluating the software you're going to use, there's a few things you want to check first. One is cost. In vivo is a subscription, and so you have to provide that cost. Deduce we use in the program for the DBA because you can do it per month. So as you're using it, you can pay for it. If you're not using it, you don't have to continue pay for it. The quality of it is not necessarily up to the software, but it's how the researcher is able to utilize all of the functions. How well are you at understanding software? So Deduce is much more simple, but in vivo provides a lot more capabilities in terms of creating graphics based on your data. And so oftentimes in chapter 4, you're going to provide graphs and charts and different types of tables relating to your analysis so that your reader can see it very quickly and understand it. Some softwares have more of that capability than others. My recommendation is first find out if any of them have free trials. Go in during your program and see if you like to use it, if it works for you. Take someone's data set and just add it to the software and see if you can play around with the words, the codes, and see if you could actually do a practice coding and theming of yourself. If you don't like it, try the next one.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Rossi, question, if you could go back and change one thing about your dissertation, what would you do differently?
I think I would have spent a little bit more time with the deduce tool. I think I just scratched the surface of what it was really capable of doing. I think I could have leveraged it a little more than what I did. I wouldn't, underestimate the learning curve for some people. I think it's easy for some people, a little more difficult. So again, for me, I would have liked a little more time with the deduce tool. And I think also after looking at the deduce tool, I believe it also had some hooks in there for quantitative as well, for a mixed method. So for a mixed method, I think it provided some advantages. I wasn't able to take advantage of those. But I think I would, get to know the tool good. If you don't like the tool, it's not working for you, I would move on to the next or the next, and not to get bogged down in the tool, because that's not the most important part. The most important part is your data and coming up with your conclusions.
Great. And then from the professional doctorate side, Dr. Hall, same question to you. If you could go back and change one thing about your DSP, what would you do differently?
So I think I would have, the topic that I chose, I wouldn't have, the original topic that I had, I think it was too broad. I think that if I would have selected a topic earlier on, that I could have actually been collecting references as I continue to move throughout the program, which when I got to the actual DSP, I would have already have collected a lot of the material that I would need to conduct my reference checks and things on.
Thank you. And next question, we're going to stay with you. Actually, let me say this first. We have an overwhelming amount of questions, so it's very impressed and glad that everyone's engaged. And just want to say that we're not going to be able to get to all of them because there's a lot out there, but we will follow up. But Dr. Hall, and how did you go about selecting your participants in your DSP?
So the personnel that I was utilizing, so I put them into a category, and I looked at them because I was doing mine on a specific topic that was related to things that took place within my organization. I first started by looking at who's actually utilized the tool. I looked at the rank, I looked at the grade. I also looked at how long they had actually been utilizing the tools, because what I found was that I also went in with some biases in regards to the actual topic, but I utilized that expert panel to actually kind of help solidify the questions that I had. And then that kind of helped also determine who need to be and who would I have as part of my participants. Thank you.
And then we have time for just a couple more questions. I'm going to send this one to Dr. Linski because it was on your section. Can you verify that data analysis processes from Yin, Braun and Clark, Saldana are not considered tools? It is my understanding the software are the analytical tools. Is this correct?
Absolutely. So the tool is anything that you're using to assist you in the process. Yin, Braun and Clark, Saldana, they are the process. So you are going to follow their structured step-by-step process in order to complete it. adding tools such as transcription software, data analysis software, those tools just make it easier for you. And some students may not want to. They may want to print out their transcripts and highlight in 30 different colors all of the words that they find, and that's acceptable. You can still do manual coding. And so just note that the tools itself are only there to provide additional resources for you.
Great, thank you. And then last question, I had I had one bookmarked here, but there's just a lot of questions to go through here. And actually, let's spin it back to our alumni panel, because people enjoyed their insight from the last question. And starting with Dr. Rossi, what advice do you have for current doctoral students?
I was muted. I would say when you're getting to understanding, whittling down your subject to what it is that you would like to talk about, I think is key. Working, finding a good, strong committee to work with, I think is extremely valuable.
And same question to you, Dr. Hall.
I would say that to look at this as a journey, as a marathon versus a sprint, because you're in it for the long haul, and you want to make sure that you're time management. Give yourself time throughout the week. I mean, to try to set aside that time, probably maybe 30 minutes. I would say about 30 minutes a day, if that's what you can do, and not try to do it all at one time. So I would say to ensure that you give yourself time to do this.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all of our presenters, and thank you to everyone that attended. A lot of questions, just an impressive amount of questions. Really happy with the engagement tonight. But I'm going to hand things back to Dr. Guzman to close out tonight's core webinar.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you everyone for attending and participating in today's core webinar, Qualitative Data Analysis for Applied Research. Please visit the core webpage to learn more about the series, and these core webinars are recorded, and again, this core webinar will also be part of this of the recordings. I want to give again a special thanks to Dr. Linski, Dr. Hall, and Dr. Rossi. Thank you for all those who attended, for your participation, interest, and the great questions. Let's continue collaborating and building knowledge. And if you would like to reach out to us or contact, our contact information is on the screen now. Thank you again, goodbye, and have a great day.